Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I know last week we didn't have an episode, and then next week we will not as well. But as I'm reaching the end of my last semester of my master's degree here at USF, we're going to have a little bit of a transition in the content. It's not going to be any less informative. It's not going to be any less educational. But as I'm just reaching the end of my classes, I will no longer have course content to pull from for these episodes. So the episodes will be a little bit more, I don't want to say personal because this is still going to be like an informative, scientific, educational podcast, but the topics that I'll be educating on will be less maybe random, so to say, because they won't be following just the topics that I'm covering as I'm sitting in class in my master's education. And rather, they're going to be topics that I pull personally. So they're going to be more relevant to me, relevant to questions that I get asked by you guys, and just relevant to maybe things that are going on or that I'm seeing in the space. And today's episode is probably going to be the least science heavy, so to say, but I did want just like a place where I can sit down and talk through the way that my training has changed and the differences I think it's made just in the past year. You guys know I've been training for the past 8 years now, since 2016. So I've been training for a really, really long time. I was chasing my pro card for 7 of those years, and it wasn't until the 7th year that I finally earned my pro card. And in the 7th year, the biggest thing that changed was the way that I trained. And it's not to dog on the way that I used to train, because I stand by the fact that I think I had to train that way to build a solid foundation. But I'm training now in a way that I used to be honestly viscerally averse to training in that style in the past. And I talk to girls who are growing and seeing changes in their body. I talk to other bodybuilders, and a lot of them will agree that they've had similar revelations and they've made similar changes in their training style throughout their journeys, and they saw similar differences in results in response to them changing their training style. So we're going to talk about that specifically in the context of training upper glutes. Why upper glutes? I don't want to say that this episode is for the girls, because boy booties matter too. But the reason I'm going to hyper focus on upper glutes as I talk through the way that my training has changed is because A, I think I've seen the biggest difference in my upper glutes, and B, I think the principles I had to apply to train my upper glutes are like the quintessential embodiment of the changes that I made in my overall training. And before I get into everything, I'm going to go through personal updates. So I have my last PhD application that I'm submitting today. Everything is pretty much ready to go. I just wanted to wake up with a fresh set of eyes before I submit it and really read through everything. And then off she is. So that'll be crazy. I'm going home to Texas to see my parents for Thanksgiving tomorrow. So I'm very, very excited to see my parents. I just had a pretty intuitive weekend. And now I'm back on all my meals except for Thanksgiving. So we have just another 2.5 weeks of just full routine minus Thanksgiving meal. And I'm honestly pretty excited because I do feel like I've been taking more flexibility than I'm used to just the past month or two, honestly. But it's been going fine. I just got hit with the wildest PMS of my life. It's still going. It's been 2 weeks of me PMSing. My Oura ring has been giving me pretty alarming stats. My body temperature was increasing progressively for a week and a half, and then on Sunday I woke up and it was so high, and body temperature, if you don't know, increases during your luteal phase, and typically it drops when you menstruate. So that body temperature increasing over time was indicative of me PMSing. It also aligned with when I was supposed to get my period, which was 7 days ago. So yeah, it's been 2 weeks of PMSing. Additionally, my resting heart rate while I was sleeping was really elevated. The lowest it got was 79 beats per minute, which is just really high. And on Sunday I woke up and I actually broke a fever for an hour of the day, and I know I sound congested and I sound a little bit under the weather, but I genuinely don't think I caught a bug. I think my body was just shutting down on me and my defenses were so low that I am expressing the symptomology of being sick, but it is just genuinely my body having no defenses. It was my body shutting down on me. I came from 3 days of back-to-back social events. Obviously, my sleeping wasn't 100%, and just the combination of the exhaustion, the lack of adequate recovery with my PMS symptoms getting progressively worse, I just think my body literally shut down on me on Sunday. But I am definitely on the come up. I was able to train yesterday and I felt a lot better doing that. I took it easy and now I feel fine, other than just my sinuses being a little congested. But I would say we're fine. We're on the come up. Body temperature is coming down. So yeah, that's my personal update. outside of that, we're still recruiting for the world's first reverse dieting intervention study. If you want to know more about just the reverse diet research, that's what my last episode was about. So go ahead and listen to the reverse dieting episode. But if you are interested in being a subject, then please email reversedietstudy@gmail.com. I think we're going to do our last recruitment push probably until the first month of the year, and then probably close off to new subjects because it's a pretty long-term commitment and we want to wrap up data collection sooner rather than later. So if you are interested, email about your interest and fill out the eligibility forms, and you can always choose a later start date, but we are going to be closing out recruitment 2025, which is insane to say. Okay, so personal updates are out of the way. Now we can get back into what the heck did I change in my training that helped me become an IFBB pro. And I don't want to say what did I change, because the changes came concomitantly with a change in coaching. When I started working with Shelby, obviously this was the first time that I had a coach that gave me a dedicated training program. And that was one of the reasons why I was looking for a new coach. I wanted somebody who did everything, because I was like, I know how to train myself, but clearly something I'm doing is not working. Okay. I just want to try a different approach, both nutrition wise and training wise. So I wanted to work with somebody who did all of the above. And when I first started training with Shelby, I think the reason why it was so important that I had somebody else do my training, again, was not because I don't know how to train myself, but it is because I was so stubborn and I had such a hard view on training, and I loved training heavy, that I was working against myself. There was a part of me that knew that there was a time and place for me to strip the load, and there was a time and place for me to go lighter and crank out more reps rather than always trying to hit more weight PRs. I knew that. I wholeheartedly knew that. But until somebody told me, put down the 20s and grab the 10, or until somebody told me, you have to go light on this, I felt like I was, for lack of a better term, pussying out on my training if I, out of my own accord, chose to go lighter. Or if I, out of my own accord, didn't push for a weight PR if I knew I could lift more. And I just knew I had to put that decision in someone else's hands so that I didn't have to bear the quote unquote guilt of feeling like I was being a pussy in the gym. That's the reason why, even though I knew the things that I had to do, I needed somebody else to tell me to do them. And it's fucked up. It's messed up. It's not the approach that you should have. So if you do your own training, this is your sign to it's gonna sound backwards. Do not be afraid to train lighter. So I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. What exactly changed? The biggest thing is that prior to my pro card winning off season, so the off season that led to me entering the prep where I turned pro finally after 7 years, I was training with a primary emphasis on strength and on weight progressions. And that's not inherently wrong, but I overemphasized what those progressions would do for me versus mind-muscle connection, tempo, form, and technical failure. So I wanted to lift heavy above all the other variables that I could have been manipulating, because I felt like if I could lift more, I should lift more. I was very compound movement focused. I loved heavy sumos. I loved heavy squats. I loved heavy hip thrusts. And like I said, heavy lifting has its time and place. I probably lift heavier now on some movements than I did before. So it's not that I don't train heavy now. It's just I don't train heavy at the expense of, first and foremost, mind muscle connection, at the expense of tempo, at the expense of recruiting and engaging the muscle that I'm actually supposed to be working. And this is extra critical when it comes to training your upper glutes. So like I said before, it was compound movements. It was going for 2 to 4 rep maxes and then stripping load and then going to failure with higher rep ranges, which I still think is a phenomenal structure. And I still do that to this day. It's just I no longer make my heavy sets in the 2 to 4 rep range. You are not going to maximize hypertrophy if you're training in a 2 to 4 rep range. You are going to maximize hypertrophy if you lift heavy and you go to failure between 7 to 8 reps and 30 to 40 reps. There's a very big window where you are maximizing hypertrophy no matter the reps you're doing, so long as it's between 7 and under 3 minutes worth of a set. Literally, that's what the data tells us. That's what the science tells us. I've cited the literature in other episodes. You know that time and time again, the literature shows whether you're training heavy or you're training light, if you're taking your set to failure and it is within the quote unquote hypertrophic rep range, you are maximizing hypertrophy. You are maximizing the growing stimulus. If your goal is to train for strength and to get stronger, this episode is not for you, because that is a completely different adaptive pathway. And I have an episode on that and you can listen to that. But if your goal is to grow and to actually see changes in your physique and specifically grow certain muscle groups that you feel like are lagging or especially hard to target, this is what we're going to discuss today. And so I'm going to really frame it in regards to upper glutes, but just know that this applies to really any kind of lagging body part or just any body part in general. So the biggest consideration you have to have when training upper glutes is how to maximize the engagement of that muscle that you're trying to grow. Specifically, your upper glute is going to be mostly your glute medius. It's going to be your upper glute maximus, and then underneath that you have your glute minimus. And so when you're comparing what your glute medius and your glute minimus looks like anatomically in comparison to your glute max, which would be like the entire portion of your glute that's like your underbutt and your mid butt. So think mid butt, underbutt. Your glute maximus is a massive muscle in comparison to your glute medius and your glute minimus. And anytime you're training a lower body movement, or you're doing a compound movement, or you're doing a movement that recruits the entirety of your glute and or additional muscles, your bigger muscles have a higher capacity for load. And if you're training something that is too heavy for your glute minimus to support or your glute medius to support, your glute maximus is going to take over. And that's fine if you're trying to grow your underbutt or you're trying to grow the overall like 3D projection of your glute. That is fine. But if you're trying to target your upper glute, which is again your glute minimus and your glute medius, most of your glute medius, it's a much smaller muscle with a much lower capacity to take on load. And in order to keep that muscle engaged throughout the movement where you're trying to target your upper glute, you have to be training light enough to where your glute medius and your glute minimus can support that load throughout the entire range of motion, and not so heavy to where your glute maximus takes over. And that was one of the first things that I had to like mentally flip a switch on. For example, say I was doing upper glute focused good mornings on the reverse hack squat, which is one of my favorite upper glute workouts. And I'm going to give you a list of my favorite upper glute workouts in a second. But say I was doing that. If I went really heavy, I could still crank out reps. But more likely than not, if I went really heavy, I was cranking out those reps, engaging primarily my glute maximus because it's a bigger muscle group and that was going to take over. If I wanted to isolate my upper glute, I had to go light enough to where I could keep my upper glute, my glute medius, my glute minimus engaged throughout the entirety of the rep, the range of motion, and the entire set. And that also meant learning when to end the set and learning to end it when I lose upper glute engagement. So say I was going lighter on upper glute good mornings and I was mentally trying to keep my upper glute engaged. And the best way to engage upper glute, honestly, is touching it and just keeping that mental focus on those muscles, like trying to mentally connect with that muscle. Touching it helps a lot. Like I would poke it, I would touch it throughout the movement, throughout the range of motion. And a lot of times when I finished my sets and I reached technical failure, I could still produce more reps. My body could still produce more reps, but they would not be reps that were being produced by my upper glute. They would be reps produced by my glute maximus taking over. And again, this is one of the things that I learned was technical failure over mechanical failure. I used to previously strictly go to mechanical failure, which meant when my body could not produce another rep. But the crazy thing is if you're training smaller muscle groups or groups that are harder to engage, if you're going to mechanical failure, chances are the last few reps that you repped out, that muscle that you're trying to engage is not responsible for producing those reps. You let other muscle groups take over. And the more that you develop your glute max disproportionately to your upper glute, the more that it actually makes your upper glute look smaller. So learning to end the set when I reached technical failure, which was when I lost engagement of my upper glute, that was something that was really hard for me to do until I like sat down with myself and got honest and was like, you are not being a pussy. You are being strategic. You are being technical. Like this is how you grow your upper glute. Okay. And that is what technical failure is versus mechanical failure. It's when form breaks down. And in this specific case, when you're trying to target a specific muscle group, form breaks down when you're no longer targeting that muscle group. And This meant that in order to reach failure of the upper glutes, it wasn't going to be by going heavier. It was going to be by taking a lighter weight and just repping it out until I lost upper glute engagement. So if previously, like 2 years ago in 2022, I was doing compound movements for, like I said, like 2 to 6 reps and then repping out something crazy as fast as I could for like lighter, but for reps. Now this was, okay, no, I'm going to put lightweight. I'm going to maintain tempo, which I'm about to talk about, and I'm going to go until I lose upper glute engagement, and that is failure. I don't care if I could still crank out 10 more reps. They would not have been cranked out by my upper glute, so I reached upper glute technical failure, and that was a huge thing that I had to like come to terms with and actually implement in my training. The other thing was focusing on tempo. I look back at old training footage, and like I said, I do think training heavy had its time and place, but I think I overutilized training heavy, like I said, at the expense of things like tempo. We see across the literature time and time again, whether you agree with the length and partials debate or not, we see that there is something valuable to training the eccentric portion of your movement. That is when you're lowering the weight in a reverse hack squat, good morning, which I guess I'll use for my examples moving forward. When you're sitting back, that's the eccentric. That's when you're stretching the muscle. Or in a hip thrust, that's when you're lowering the bar. Coming up would be the concentric. That's the actual contraction. And a lot of times we focus on the contraction, but literature tells us that there might be something even more anabolic about training the eccentric portion. At the very least, even if we don't have full confidence in the studies supporting length and partials being more hypertrophic, we at least know that they're possibly as hypertrophic as going through the full range of motion. Additionally, we know that the eccentric portion induces more damage. We know that training the eccentric portion actually helps with injury prevention. So there is something going on in the lengthening or in the eccentric portion of a movement that is really, really beneficial. And when I was training really heavy at the expense of tempo, I would if I was doing deadlifts, I would raise the bar and then drop it, pick it up, drop it, just so fast and almost carelessly and lawlessly. And now my focus is on specific tempos. More often than not, every single movement I do has a slower eccentric than a concentric. So when I'm doing good mornings, I am lowering and I'm sitting back way slower than I'm coming up and contracting. Same with hip thrust, same with kickbacks, same with any kind of abductor, same with any kind of RDL, same with any kind of lunge. Anything I'm doing, literally anything I'm doing, more often than not, my tempo is going slower on the eccentric than on the concentric. And that is a tempo that I think has also made a huge difference in my training. And it's supported by science. I mean, like I said, we don't have full confidence to say that training in the length and portion of a range of motion is more anabolic or more hypertrophic, but we do know that there is something happening in that eccentric portion that is different than in the concentric portion. And making sure that you're not bypassing the eccentric portion of your range of motion by going so fast and carelessly that you're just throwing weights down, that is really, really important, and I think made a huge, huge difference. The other thing was honestly just switching my form on a lot of things. I tend to naturally gravitate towards a very sumo stance, and we think it might feel theoretically a more sumo stance engages more outer glute, but it actually doesn't. It engages more adductor, and I had to fight my natural anatomy and the way my hips naturally sit to really focus on actually doing a lot more of higher and more narrow stances. So if I do reverse hack squats, squatting, if I do pendulum squats, if I do Smith machine squats, I do a lot of just more narrow, and leg press, I do narrow and high. It just engages more of my upper glute, especially when I'm focusing on lowering the bar down and sitting into that upper glute and just mentally connecting with it. The kind of last thing that I'm going to touch on is, in general, the exercise selection. Like I said, I use live and breathe the no pussy shit mantra, and I still think it has its time and place. I still think no pussy shit, go hard, work fucking hard, but also put in that effort into the things that are actually going to produce the results you want. And I think before I embodied the no pussy shit kind of idea in the wrong way. It meant big lifts, heavy lifts, compound lifts, all this big bad things in the gym, and you would never catch me dead setting up reverse hyperextensions on the Smith machine, or doing frog pumps, or doing kickbacks on the Smith, or doing a lot of things that might seem really girly and silly. And I genuinely don't know the last time that I touched a free barbell. because I do all my movements on either the Smith machine, the reverse hack squat, the pendulum squat, the leg press, and I do free dumbbell stuff, but nothing crazy heavy. Even my RDLs, I do them on the Smith machine. And the reason why I'm choosing these machines is because they allow me to control the range of motion, control the tempo, and retain mind-muscle connection throughout the entirety of the range of motion so much better. When I do RDLs on the Smith machine, having that bar path that's just set in place, that I don't have to engage additional muscles just to stabilize the bar, allows me to keep any and all of my focus into my upper glute or my outer glute or whatever it is I'm training on that specific day. So exercise selection changed a lot for me. Doing a lot of isolated movements versus big compound lifts made a huge difference, because it is those isolated movements that are going to help you target such a small muscle as your glute medius and your glute minimus. And that for me this is where the little nifty list of my favorite upper glute exercises comes in. That list for me is, again, reverse hyperextensions on the Smith machine. This is where you have to set up a bench under the Smith, lay on the bench, stomach down, and then put your feet on the bar and push it up. It looks and feels really awkward. I don't even know how to explain it verbally. Something I never thought that I would be the girl in the gym doing that. And it genuinely has made such a huge difference in my upper glute training, response, size, everything. Reverse hack squat good mornings, both normal and B stance. I will stand by these. And I also really like to do these on the Smith machine. So if you don't have a reverse hack squat, I find them equally as good on the Smith machine, so long as you're controlling the tempo and really focusing on mind muscle connection. And again, going to technical, not mechanical failure. Doing abductor machines of different varieties. I have not been able to quite figure out which exact variation of an abductor I feel most in my upper glutes. Sometimes I like leaning forward. Sometimes I like leaning forward and hovering. I have a theory that the kind that I am able to engage with most depends on what I did prior to the abductors on that specific session. So sometimes I play around with it until I find the right variation that I connect with. But just play around with abductors, try the machine, try cable abductors, and play around with it, fidget with it until you find one where you're like, okay, I'm able to touch my upper glute, lock in with it, and now let me rep some things out to technical failure. Also, this is going to sound crazy, but banded lying abductors, banded laying clamshells. Never did I think I'd be the kind of girl to go from heavy hip thrusts to laying on the little gym floor with a glute loop band around my knees and cranking out some little clamshells. But when I tell you that shit literally directly just pinpoints my upper glute like nothing else, I will not skip these ever. I will not skip these ever. And then Smith glute bridges and Smith frog pumps are also really good. And then banded Smith machine 1 1/4 hip thrusts. So doing hip thrusts on the Smith machine where you do a full extension, slow down, then you come up and you do a pulse at the top while keeping a band around your knees. That, to me, having that band really engages your outer glute, and getting the full stretch at the bottom is going to engage your upper glute. And then really focusing on the contraction at the top, takes advantage of every portion of the range of motion. And I think you're going to have to go lighter on this, and you're going to have to go higher rep. But taking that to technical failure, I find super engaging of my upper glute. So again, the biggest thing when it comes to upper glute training is that you just can't go very heavy, because your upper glute, your glute min and your glute medius cannot sustain the load, and then your glute max is going to immediately take over. And because it's so light, and you have to go very high rep, and you have to focus a lot on mentally engaging the upper glute. And then also, because you can't bring the intensity via load, because you just can't go that heavy, because then you lose engagement, the intensity is going to have to come from reps, and it's going to have to come from tempo. So use the tempo in your favor to increase the intensity. I used to think that I would just throw load on the bar until it hurt. And now I have a set load on the bar. It's not very heavy. And I think about it in the sense of how much pain can I derive from every single rep. If I can mentally engage and make each rep, if I can make myself feel that to the greatest extent that I possibly could each and every rep, that is how I engage. And that usually means slowing it the fuck down, focusing on that eccentric portion, maintaining a steady tempo, and going light enough, and then just repping it out. And when I say repping it out, that doesn't mean fast. Again, it just means keep going until you lose engagement. And again, that intensity, that failure, that technical failure is not going to come from load. It's not going to come from the weight on the bar or on the machine. It's going to come from you forcing the intensity through reps, through tempo, and through forcing the mind-muscle connection and the engagement of the muscle that you're targeting. So I know a lot of what I said was in the context of upper glutes, but please apply this to any other muscle group that you really want to grow and you just feel like what you're doing isn't working. Like I said, all of this is supported by literature, and I do think that there is benefit to training for strength and for hypertrophy, because as you induce the strength adaptations, they can translate to a greater capacity for progressing through a hypertrophic training program. And the most recent training program that I dropped, which I've talked about on the podcast before, because I dropped it before we went through a bunch of literature, and then I went through the literature and I was like, oh my God, all of this literally supports the training program I put out. I'm so proud and happy. That is the hypertrophy and strength training program. You do 1 week of strength training, 1 week of hypertrophy, 1 week of strength, 1 week of hypertrophy. You oscillate back and forth. And like during my pro card off season, before I turned pro, this off season where I feel like I made the most changes, I ran that split, and I found that I made an enormous amount of improvements running a split of that sort. So there's a lot of different ways that you can incorporate the philosophies that I talked about today. But if you just want like a place to start, I would recommend that training program. Of all the ones that are on my site, that would be the one that I think would be most tailored to the things we've talked about today and the improvements that I assume you're looking for if you're listening to this podcast. So with that, I'm going to give you guys back the rest of your day. There will not be an episode next week because it is my last week of classes. So I have all my research papers and projects, and it's pre-finals. So I'll be locked the F in for finals, but we will resume back. Again, some of the topics are going to change as I no longer have course content to pull from, but hopefully you guys find it just as helpful and just as educational and just as informative. And until the next episode, I hope you guys have an amazing Thanksgiving, an amazing Black Friday. I will include the links to all the sales that I am involved with, any support codes. I will put everything in the description. If you do support me, it means more than you know. And with that, I will see you guys in the next episode.